MinIO has announced the expansion of its partnership with VMware, connecting MinIO object storage with VMware Cloud Foundation and Tanzu through vSAN data persistent platform. To learn more about this partnership and these new offerings, today we have with us Anand Babu Periasamy, CEO and co-founder of MinIO. Uh, First of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I want to learn a bit about the company itself. Tell us a bit about MinIO. You are one of the co-founders. So, what problem you saw in the space that you wanted to solve that you created MinIO?
Yeah, when we started MinIO, the idea behind MinIO was to uh, look for a problem that 10 years from now that only compounds and grows, and pick a simple problem and build a powerful brand of trust and love. Right? Anything you do like this, you can't go wrong, right? And one such problem that every major trend pointed out to was world will produce more data no matter what. And we then around creation of data, the biggest problem is how do you store and manage this data? And if you build a brand around it, you can't go wrong. And that's where MinIO was born. And it's a simple idea of the enterprise world, right? Today, if you see, they like to build complex solutions to simple problems, right? And that's not what customers and users want. And today, particularly, the scale is so large. What you want is a simple solution to complex problems that are actually very large in size, and they also faced by all over like applications and users all over the world. So we started with this idea of object storage, right? If you looked at the public cloud, they actually understood this problem because they had the scale, they had the volume and users. So they came up with this idea of object storage. It's not exactly their idea, but they understood the problem well and they finally perfected it. And the solution, like the closest thing you see in the public cloud, is Amazon S3. And Amazon actually launched Amazon S3 even before launching any other cloud service, and it redefined the infrastructure space, right? And we knew the rest of the world will soon need something like Amazon S3, and the bulk of world's data that is produced is actually outside of the public cloud. And if you are outside Amazon AWS, that's the market we wanted to go after. MinIO is object storage, even API compatible with Amazon S3, and it is today the world's fastest growing object storage out there.
If you look at object storage, it's especially in the open source space, it's kind of crowded space. So, how do you differentiate yourselves from not only other players but also other projects where of course, you leverage a lot of open source, but what value do you bring to the ecosystem?
Yeah, we for us, open source is a philosophy, right? You either believe in it or you don't, right? But when it comes to building a product, I think end of the day, open source is not a differentiator. You still have to solve the problem better than anybody else. And historically, open source was seen as an inferior clone to some proprietary high-end system, right? That was not the thinking behind MinIO. And we wanted to actually be the best of the breed in its class. It's an object storage first, and then it's open source because we believe in the philosophy, right? And while it looks crowded from the outside, we knew that the market will consolidate, right? It's actually very hard for customers to just pick like anything because it has that X feature or Y feature. It's really hard for them to make that call because they are risking their business data, even if it is lots of cat videos. Like try like losing an account on a Facebook, right? Like some social media. It's actually disastrous. It makes headlines. No one wants to lose data if it is whether it's public cloud or private cloud. And look at every one of the leading storage vendor out there. They are actually all hardware appliance vendors. They are many generations behind public cloud. And in the modern world, a storage, it's not even about software defined storage, right? It has to run as a container, as a Kubernetes native infrastructure. The world is so much far ahead. And look at every storage vendor, they are still talking about fiber channel over Ethernet and iSCSI and hardware appliance. you need specialized controller, NVMe over Fabric as the new trend. They completely missed the idea of all the innovations that are happening in the public cloud. And now Kubernetes brought it to the rest of the world. And this is where MinIO, that starting late and understanding the problem and not actually seeing ourselves as we are the kernel hackers and file system developers, right? We saw the problem from a very simple end user perspective. Nowadays, the application developers, they don't even know what fstab is. They're like, even NFS mount, if you tell them, it's like, it's not mounting. I don't know why I should be root. They just want an SDK to access the storage service just like they would access any other application API through REST API. And this is where a simple idea, but something that is so powerful and it is simple, right? How MinIO got it? If you see MinIO, they actually position it as a high performance, high end petascale object storage, but its greatest strength is simplicity, right? Someone with very little programming experience, even, right? Like if you just learned JavaScript fresh out of your college in 2 weeks, you will learn that starting MinIO is even simpler than Node.js or some MongoDB like database. And it's that simplicity. And simplicity did not mean that it was actually an entry class. It was a high-end system made ridiculously simpler, and that is where MinIO got all its strength. And the simplicity comes from architectural details. In simple terms, we actually did not think like a traditional file system or storage developer, right? And that it's a fresh thinking. We can go into the detail later, but it's fundamentally the simplicity is the differentiating factor.
And yeah, and that is what we need, because the whole idea was to simplify things, but now you need so many tools when you're, and if you just look at the CNCF landscape, you cannot even see it on one screen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's true. Now let's talk about, since we're talking simplicity and making it easier for you, let's talk about your partnership with VMware, and also let's deep dive into yesterday's announcement.
So yesterday's partnership is actually making MinIO run natively on VMware. It's a tighter integration with VMware vSAN Direct, and vSAN is the block layer, it's the storage layer, right? And in simpler terms, what does it mean to the end user? Now you can run high performance data intensive workloads on VMware natively, including the storage itself, right? If you see, like before this announcement, what are people doing with their data infrastructure? Like name it, like from data warehouse solutions to analytics, AI, ML workloads, big data workloads, they're all running on bare metal. And it is so primitive, and it is something that even IT is so frustrated about. And if you took those workloads to the public cloud, certainly there is productivity, but it becomes very, very expensive in a very short time. And these machines are kept busy around the clock. It gets very expensive, data is very sensitive, and they were all running on bare metal. And Hadoop's biggest problem was the operational nightmare, right? No, these organizations did not know how to deal with it, and that led to the failure of Hadoop. And Hadoop is just one part of the segment, right? Now, what yesterday's announcement, what it showed was now you can run those kind of high performance data workloads natively on VMware, because now VMware now has an object storage with MinIO running on top of vSAN. And VMware made two considerable improvements for us, right? Like one was that vSAN itself was improved to do vSAN Direct, that allowed us to have access to petabytes and petabytes worth of drives and direct access to them. And it gives you performance at a much more attractive price point because there is no overhead there. It's a direct access, right? And then the second part was they brought Kubernetes native into the heart of vSphere. It's not some hack that you run Kubernetes on top of VMs, right? They brought Kubernetes support at the vSphere core level, which made MinIO port natively into the vSphere architecture without we making any compromise. And that is a significant move from an industry point of view, because finally we see the shadow IT, the applications team, the DevOps and Kubernetes inside these companies. Now they ran in silos, and the IT ran in the infrastructure. They couldn't connect, right? And this time around, all the cloud native applications that are running on VMware, they can now be managed at the physical layer by the IT. So IT and the cloud native ecosystem can coexist. And from MinIO's point of view, that we finally can turn these Kubernetes deployments inside these organizations into an IT managed service. In the long run, it simply boils down to the public cloud and the private cloud as a hybrid cloud world. The lines will blur. Everybody will look like Kubernetes, and now the software stack can be deployed anywhere without any modification.
I also want to hear your thoughts on, uh, uh, what is the importance of this vSAN data persistent platform announcement for the ecosystem itself? Because if you look at VMware ecosystem, it's kind of growing. So I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's actually there is the name that if you see it talks about data persistence, not storage, right? It's actually a big change in the storage industry, right? In the past, the storage companies continue to sell storage appliance, right? Even if you see the stock Kubernetes, the CSI driver, the storage appliance vendors would write a driver, a CSI driver, which is just a volume provisioner and manager, right? And it's just when application requests some storage, the CSI driver would go create the volume and then provision it, like attach it to the container. But what that meant was only the Kubernetes layer was the compute layer was managed by Kubernetes, and the storage layer still continued to remain a hardware appliance. And what is the problem with that? You basically have only modernized compute layer, and the storage layer is very primitive and old school. And the problem with this is, like, if you now take your application stack and deploy anywhere else, you cannot move it because the data is sitting on a hardware appliance. You cannot lift and shift. You cannot even deploy that hardware appliance on the public cloud, right? And with the data persistence layer, what VMware did was containerize everything, not just the compute layer. VMware already got a grip on the compute layer because they pioneered that layer, right? And they did the compute to virtualization. Now they are doing compute to containerization, right? And then they also have a good grip on the networking layer with the software defined networking layer. That's the NSX, right? And the storage layer, this is the first time you actually take the entire storage software and run it on VMware natively. And this time around, it's not just running your storage server itself, the entire storage software stack itself on VMware, like object storage. They also put it along the side of metadata database, right? Now the database and object storage are no different from an application point of view. The VMware's data persistence service is basically anything that stores data persistently, whether it is a database or an object storage. Now it puts both of them on an equal footing, and that is actually how we see the world too. In fact, databases are far more complicated than an object storage, because they have to deal with query language and lots of mutable data. It's just the amount of data is not that big, but the problem engineering wise is very complicated. But technically, a database and an object storage are basically data service layer, and the difference is one stores tiny metadata, that is database, and object storage stores blob data. And by putting both as a storage container and calling them as a data persistence service, now all the applications, their goal should be to go towards a stateless model. That's the cloud native world, right? And all the states a stateless service has to manage the state somewhere, and that state could be a metadata or data. Data comes to object storage, metadata goes to the database, and now from an application point of view, they make a claim on, I want this much space, and the VMware data persistence layer provisions the buckets and databases for the application. It truly gives a pure cloud native like infrastructure. From an application point of view, now you can finally deploy anywhere you can, like public cloud or private cloud or multi-cloud or edge. Everything is containerized and distributed and managed through Kubernetes.
Awesome. Before we wrap this up, I just want to learn a bit about your open source story as well. You did touch upon it in the beginning, but number one is, how critical is open source to MinIO? And if you can talk about the contribution you're making to the open source project that you're leveraging, at the same time, what are the open source projects you're leveraging?
Yeah, I'm personally a free software guy, right? And you know the difference between open source and free software. For me, what matters is the software freedom, right? And it's an ideology, right? The very basic thing they teach you in schools or even your parents, what you learn is you share with others and then you improve upon, and that is not the reason why customers pay, right? It's not a business model. It is a value system, and that is how we as mankind made progress till today, right? Everything that we have achieved today is a result of improving upon previous ideas, and that's how we see the world. And business is not about making money at any cost, right? Ethics and business, making money is important, and it's not about making money at any cost, but at the same time, this is not a charity. We need to make business, we need to make money, right? But we see this as two complete orthogonal goals. And when it comes to an ideology, you either believe in it or you don't, right? We don't believe in the open core model that we feel like it's a bait and switch, right? You create crippleware. I find that even if I told you that it's completely proprietary, I'm not misleading you, right? It's better for me to be honest, and it's a relationship that when you build a business, it's super important to build a brand of honesty, right? And if I told you something, I would rather tell you less and give you more, but I would never mislead you. And this is where, for us, because open source is, or free software is a philosophy we believe in, we actually are 100% free software company, right? Everything like everything we develop, we build is 100% free software. Now, free software or open source, free software, I mean free as in freedom, right? And now, when it comes to business, why are customers paying for a piece of software? It's not because we gave them a license key, right? It is because we solved a real business problem, and they couldn't find a better solution than what we built. And they see that this is a brand they can trust and build a long-term relationship. That is why business happens, right? Now, if we have not earned that reputation of a brand that they can trust and love, we would not build a long-term viable company. And open source, completely outside, we actually want to solve a real business problem and then build honesty and trust with the customers. And customers, why are they paying us? Like in the end, for a particular piece of software, this is a piece of software that they are putting their business data on it, and a data loss or a data breach would be far more expensive than anything they would pay us. And also, many of these customers are building proprietary software themselves, and they don't want to be obligated by the open source license restrictions, because open source license would expect them to build open source software too, in the spirit of freedom. And we, as the creator of the software, we actually own the copyright, so we can give the customer, when they pay, it's actually quite okay because it funds the company, right? And they buy a commercial exception because they chose to keep their software proprietary. But a bigger reason is not the commercial license itself. It is, you don't want to lose data, or you don't want to have a data breach.
Right. No, thanks. Yeah, for explaining that. Because if you look at free software, the free software I look at it as solving the day one problem. You can grab the code from anywhere you want. You can install it. But when it comes to day two, management, fixing, updating, that's where commercial support comes into. And commercialization of open source has played a very important role in the sustainability of open source project and building a kind of a very healthy ecosystem around these projects. Because also open source is or free software is and should not be a charity that you do in your free time. There should be a selfish motive, because when I talk to Linus and all those people, they say we want selfish user, because when your own interest is attached to that open source project or free software project, that will ensure the sustainability. Because with charity, you may lose interest tomorrow and you may go and do something else. So commercialization of open source is critical, and it's good to see a healthy booming ecosystem around all these. Today, actually, when I started my journey, I was in open source, that was my specialization. But that was a niche back then, 15 years ago. Now everything is open source, so it's become so hard but I think that we are going in the same cycle. Back in those days, we used to tell people why you should use free software, and today even everybody is using it. it has become so ubiquitous they don't even realize they're open source, they're a user of open source, and then they also don't know how to become a good open source citizen, because that's when sometimes so yeah, it's it's like fashion, you keep going back in the same loop.
I think now the customers understood this case, right? One, if you see technically, open source should be more expensive than proprietary, because the same software you are also getting freedom, which is even more valuable, right? Technically, it should be more, because it's more valuable. You should also pay more for it. But in return, that we see this as a disruption to the proprietary world, and that is how the open source disrupted everything out there. Today it's impossible to build some large reliable infrastructure without using an open source component, right? Facebook to anything, right? Like Amazon or Google, none of them would exist if there was no open source or free software around. It changed the entire industry landscape, and today it has become a norm, right? That's how you build infrastructure.
Right, and also open source, when you mix it with with these some of these cloud technologies, inference technologies, it has democratized software development, because all those companies that you see today, they I mean, even if they can build their application so fast, they can add features so fast. That was not possible in back in those days, when you have to build all that data center yourself. There's so much overhead cost back in those days. Today it doesn't matter. So yeah, it's a sea change in the way we write software. Anand, thank you so much for taking time out today and talking not only about MinIO, VMware, but also you're kind of a bit into free software as well. And I actually look forward to talk to you again, because I'm pretty sure you have some not only great stories to talk about, not only from a customer but also ecosystems perspective. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you, Swapnil. It's actually wonderful talking to you, right? Like seeing same background, right? And anytime, thank you for having me on the show.